Hi. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Molly for an afternoon to celebrate technology, literature, and culture in Ireland. Thank you, Margaret, for the demonstration. This afternoon's event is hosted by the Victor Project, which is a European Research Council funded project at the intersection of literature and data analytics. So we have what you might call a particular interest in literature and technology. I'm very pleased to see at least one member of our team contributing to this volume. But also really interested this afternoon to listen to the contributors to what is a landmark volume, but also to maybe move on from this to create more debate, ask different questions. Where do we go from now, from here, where we have this piece of work as a kind of a launch pad for discussion around literature, technology, and culture. I'm going to hand over first to Professor Ronan MacDonald in Australia, and he is going to join us. He is the series editor for Topics in Irish Literature.
Print and publishing, the telegraph, the gramophone and the radio, the very idea of Ireland emerged and was mediated. Over 16 essays that look at a wide range of literature in English and Irish, this volume charts the development of these older technologies through to the emergence of contemporary digital and computational technology that marks contemporary Irish society and Irish literature. Remarkably, the volume treats technology not just as a theme or trope within Irish literature, but also as the condition of possibility of that literature, materially speaking, both through the history of the book and also as the condition by which ideas of nationality and transnationality form and unform. Future volumes from the series Cambridge Themes in Irish Literature and Culture, currently in press or about to emerge into the world, are Race, Transnationalism, Revivals, and Religion. So there's 5 volumes currently conceived. So please look out for those other 4. But Technology, the one we're marking today, was the first to be commissioned and is now, to my delight, the first to appear, bright and bold. It's a remarkable book, and I wish it every success. My hearty good wishes to Margaret, James, and all the contributors. I hope you have a really rich panel discussion today and a great day and all. Thank you very much.
Nice to hear from James in Melbourne. Can I hand over more close to home now to my colleague and friend Maragret Kelleher?
Great.
Going to
it's a real pleasure to be here. We often spend our lives kind of looking ahead at projects, so it's really nice to celebrate one that's done, but also to talk about the conversations, that we hope it'll engender from today and onwards. I want to begin by expressing my own thanks to Geraldine Meany, always the most stalwart of supporters and inspiring of colleagues. Also to Dr. Katie Mishler and Dr. Lloyd Wright for all the work they've done to make today possible, and also to colleagues here in Mali. It's a pleasure to be here in the front of the scene rather than sometimes behind the scenes, so that's a huge delight. I also do want to express thanks to colleagues at Cambridge University Press, and they're thanked in the volume, but it's a particular delight to be here with panel contributors. You're going to be hearing from some of them later today in the panel chaired by Geraldine. You're going to be hearing in more detail from Professor Kathryn Conrad, who'll be giving the keynote at 4. But I especially want to welcome Maura Kennedy and Sean Moore, who are also with us today in person. And I know a number of contributors are present online. I'm just going to take maybe 7 or 8 minutes to talk a bit about the genesis of the book, but also its themes. And I particularly want to start by expressing my huge thanks to my co-editor, Dr. James O'Sullivan. Regrettably, James can't be with us in person today, but he's with us live on Zoom. And his vision for this project is crucial to really every part of today. I checked with James that I had permission to tell the story, and he said, I do have permission, because he said he tells it regularly. And the story is as follows. That the project actually began when James contacted me planning to do an Irish Research Council funded postdoctoral fellowship. And we worked on the application together and built the sort of bonds that working on an IRC application promotes, and getting lots of smiles of recognition from people in the room on that. James was successful in his postdoctoral application, but at the same time was offered a position in Cork, which has turned in wonderfully to a permanent position there. So we didn't have the chance to work together on the postdoc, and we both said, gosh, we really should find another chance to work together. Enter Ronan MacDonald, who was putting this project together, and we thought this is the chance to do it. And a really happy working relationship resulted. Many of you in the room know James either personally or through his scholarship, and you know just how visionary and courageous his scholarship has been, and the way in which he always accompanies that with insight, good judgment, and unvarying good humour. So can there be better qualities in a co-editor? But we did the project during COVID times, and we really had a strong sense, that we were all completing our chapters, at times that were personally challenging and often very demanding. So again, a heartfelt thanks to our contributors, for being so cooperative and positive all through that. I often think it would be fun to kind of look at the spaces in which we were all writing our chapters. I was certainly writing mine in different versions of rental accommodation, so the spaces and the lines work very well together. But it was a COVID project, and as I say, just the insight and the substance of the contributions, were remarkable in face of that. And maybe even it might be something we can discuss. Maybe in turn our contributions were maybe somewhat shaded by that, the way in which technology was playing a part in our lives during those times, but also, gosh, the key role that literature was playing as well. On that note, I want, when you get a volume, if you don't have one already, and we have order forms with a discount available to take away, and also, you might be able to bring that to your home libraries as well. I do want to direct you to a wonderful aspect of the volume, which was that we were given permission to quote in full a poem by the late, greatly esteemed and much missed Evan Boland, and really grateful to the publishers, who allowed us the chance to reproduce it in full. And there are lots actually of links, to Evan Boland in this volume, but there are two very powerful links to this very room that Benedict Schlepper-Connolly, my colleague from Mali, head of programming and exhibitions, will remember, which is that we had a very moving event, recently linked to Irish Pen, which gave a posthumous award to Evan Boland. Thankfully, she knew of the giving of the award while she was still with us, but the award, alas, was given posthumously. It was awarded to her two daughters and her lifelong friend, Mary Robinson, in this very room on the 26th of June, 2022. But then we discovered an even more uncanny link, which was that 7 years previously to the day, on the 26th of June 2015, Evan herself had been in this room and stood at that lectern as part of a celebration of W.B. Yeats, of the 150th anniversary of Yeats's birth, that we organised here in 2015, when Molly was just a kind of twinkle in the eye. This was in 2015. Evan spoke beautifully about Yeats, and actually that recording is on YouTube. I'll be very happy to share it if anyone would like it. But there was a sense that the light came in almost the same way it's coming in this very beautiful room. So it's a very powerful link back to her. And if for those of you maybe new to Mali, this is also the famous room from the Tungus scene in Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. We like to think that this is the fireplace from that scene. It's the room from which Flann O'Brien was evicted on more than one occasion for being obstreperous. And these obviously are the buildings also in which Maeve Binchy studied, Kate O'Brien studied, Mary Lavin, and many more. So how's that for a pedigree before we get even started? But I would like to read, as I say, the opening of Evan Boland's poem, and we were so pleased that we had permission to quote it in full, and it's called Code. An ode to Grace Murray Hopper, 1906 to 88, maker of a computer, compiler and verifier of COBOL. Poet to poet, I imagine you at the edge of language at the start of summer in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, writing code. You have no sense of time, no sense of minutes even. They cannot reach inside your world. Your grey workstation with when, yet, now, never, and once. You have missed the other 7. This is the 8th day of creation. I've heard a number of anecdotes, but also I think true stories from colleagues of Evan Boland in Stanford, where if you had a problem with your computer in the English department in Stanford, you went to Evan Boland to fix it. And one of the stories is that she once took a computer apart to figure out how it was put together. So how's that again for a link between literature and technology? So just for a couple of more minutes, I would like to introduce some of the concepts in the volume and its context, and I'm quoting from parts of the introduction here. We make the point that obviously, crucially, technology shapes personal interactions, public spaces, institutions, and politics. It's a subject whose temporal frame can appear mostly contemporaneous and occasionally prospective, a frame of discovery, innovation, and rupture. But one of the things I think that James and I are most proud of is the way in which this volume shows that the literary genealogy of technology in the Irish context is long and varied. It's plumbed and probed in the earliest of Irish literary works. And just as technological inventions themselves enabled Irish literature and its wonderful creative practitioners to adapt, to diversify, to experiment, and to flourish. So, as Ronan mentioned in his words, examining how authors have embraced technology as a theme is only part of the dynamic of this volume. It's also important for us to look at how technology operates on literature as an inherent part of literary process, its form and aesthetics. This also meant that for us curating the volume, and I really like that word curating for what we were doing as editors, is also an act of recovery, that we were seeking to reclaim cultural authority from a simplistic progress narrative. And I think that's already maybe a key theme for all of us, avoiding any sort of simplistic progress narrative. And we especially, and I'm sure I'm in good company today in saying this, we wanted to reclaim our cultural authority from any narrow prioritisation of the disciplines of science and engineering without reference to their humanistic core. So it's not surprising that in terms of looking for historical predecessors or antecedents, that a number of the essays concentrate on the period of the Irish literary revival, when I think in fascinating ways comparable debates to today occurred as to the relative standing of art, science, technology and creativity. And in that regard, I refer you to fine essays by Aoife Lynch, by Catherine Ebury and by Kathryn Conrad. But also the genealogies traced in the volume are longer than that and often unpredictable. And so we're tracing how the advent of new technologies can involve continuity, but also rupture, sometimes in very surprising ways. So I refer you, for example, to Mark Cable's chapter, the opening chapter in the collection, which looks at the long coexistence of script and print in modern Irish language culture, a coexistence that's much longer than might be thought. To Maura Kennedy's fine essay on the history of printing and publishing technologies, their diversity and their vitality, and to the chapter by Chris Morash, which very elegantly shows us how histories of orature and technologies of sound overlap. We were also keen to show how any sort of valorization of narratives of technical progress can be resisted powerfully and effectively by literary representations. And Sean Moore shows us this very convincingly in his chapter on Jonathan Swift, which balances, I think, very nicely with similar explorations by Barry Shields, where he's looking at work by Edna O'Brien, Stuart Parker, and Mike McCormack. So indeed, as Ronan himself mentioned, we were keen to show then that technology has had a major influence on the form and content of Irish writing. And we are really proud, I think, of the different modes that are reflected in the volume. They involve print, as I mentioned earlier, from Maura and Mark Cable's chapters, also the optical telegraph, a really compelling chapter by Joanna Wharton looking at Mariah Edgeworth, and Chris Morash, the essay I mentioned earlier, which looks at the gramophone, Barry Shields looking at electricity, and a great pairing that we're proud of chapters about radio and broadcasting from Ian Whittington and Robert Savage. But there's a key aspect to our historical lens, and that is that it spans over 1,000 years of artistic production. So our section on invention in the volume begins with Morny Voynig's chapter on medieval Irish literature and its writing of Ireland's past as a story of connections. And she shows in that chapter how the technology of writing in medieval Irish literature had the doubleness, that keeps coming back, I think, in this volume, technology as process and also as theme. And Moore's chapter pairs, I think, very vibrantly with her colleague Sharon Abutna's chapter. They've been colleagues on the wonderful electronic dictionary of the Irish language project, which in turn led to that wonderful publication, History of Ireland in 100 Words. Many of you might know that volume. Sharon's chapter charts the emergence and development of a selection of technological terms in both medieval and modern Irish. And one of the examples I always think of there is that the Irish language word for spam, and I hope I'm not massacring it in my, not having checked this, but I think it's tusker, is an Irish language word for form of seaweed that's left behind when the tide goes out. and so Sharon's chapter is full of examples of that, how even contemporary words for technological innovation, capture just centuries of knowledge. I'm not going to talk a lot about the last collection of the volume, because it's very amply represented by the people from whom you're going to hear in a moment. But just to say, we had a great, I suppose, what would you say, lightning moment, James and I, in organising the volume, and we're very pleased with it. It's in thematic clusters, genealogies, infrastructures, invention, and the digital. So linking with some of the work in the Victor project, we're foregrounding some of the chapters from the digital in the panel that will proceed, but do look forward to comments from other contributors in the round table, in the conversation later, more informally. I do want to mention before I close, the two other chapters in the digital collection. Vic Merriman, in his chapter on Irish theatre, looks at theories of surveillance and textual representations of surveillance, and shows that the plays of Samuel Beckett function as a kind of fulcrum in a theatrical history of staging and thematising surveillance that goes from Dion Boucicault and Augusta Gregory up to Enda Walsh and David Lloyd. And last and not least, in the final chapter in the collection, James O'Sullivan gives us a history and also a critique of born digital literature in Ireland, looking both at its emergence and present state. And his case study is on the work of Doireann Ní Ghríofa, known for so many of her really genre-bending works. But in this case, James is focusing on her film poems, which are less widely known than her, for now at least, than her print-based work. And James contends, and I think argues very persuasively in the volume, that film poetry is the dominant form of digital writing in Ireland. Maybe that might be debated by colleagues to follow, but certainly compares Irish digital literature, I think, in very suggestive ways with its international counterparts in this regard. So I suppose just to finish, I want to come back to a line from Yvonne Boland's poem, where she says, "We are still human," in the conclusion of her tribute to Grace Murray Hopper. It's a welcome reminder, I think, for the Ireland of today, where maybe some of the human aspects of communication, performance and consumption can be neglected. But one of the things that the Boland poem, I think, reminds us, and it can be seen throughout this volume, is in the context of Irish culture, how lucky we are that the relations are so vibrant between creative practitioners, literary artists, and technological pioneers. So thanks for your attention.
Okay, now I'm looking forward to all of this. I really enjoyed all of that, but I'm looking forward to all of this. Our discussion is going to focus, as Margaret said, on the more contemporary, to a large extent, and the final section of this volume on the digital. So I want to introduce the panellists in order, and then each of them is going to talk a little bit about their chapter here and introduce other topics which they think we might want to discuss arising from that. And then we'll open it to the floor and have a broader discussion. Okay. So I think many of you will know Claire Lynch's work on, well, I think one of the very, very first volumes and very first pieces of work to address cyberculture and the digital in Irish literature. Also more recently, a very distinguished memoirist, and again, somebody who has crossed boundaries between creative fiction and academic writing in really interesting ways. And you can see that in this chapter, in this volume, Claire. So if I can hand over to Claire.
Sure, thanks. One of the things that James asked us to do was to try and capture our key findings and sort of see where they're leading, think towards kind of future work. So the chapter I've written is called Consoling Machines in Contemporary Irish Fiction. And it begins with another of these kind of 100 books, really, the History of Ireland in 100 Objects, Fintan O'Toole's curation of that. And the object is the Intel microprocessor. And the chapter starts with that because I think it's a kind of fascinating idea that this tiny object is a way of explaining or symbolizing this sense of the significance of computer technology, digital technologies, in this sort of, and kind of making them belong to a kind of history of Irish culture. But the thing that interests me is it's not that we interact with. It's the things that the microprocessor fits inside. So one of the things that we think about when we think of technologies, and this is an idea that comes from the theorist T.L. Taylor, is that there's a promise in technology that technologies are magical. They bring with them all of these kind of opportunities and transformative effects. But the reality, as Taylor says, is that technologies are usually much more mundane. So it's the laptop you might have had on your kitchen table this morning, or the phone that most people have probably got in their pocket or in their bag today. And that sort of characterization, not between the sort of glamour of the thing that really functions, like the microprocessor, but the thing that we hold in our hands. So whether you check the bus timetable on your way here, or you check Google Maps to check that you are on the right side of the green this morning, if you're me, or whatever the thing is, that's the kind of mundane interaction. And my chapter looks at the idea that what is true in life, in this case, is also true in fiction, so that the way in which contemporary Irish novelists are reflecting this same change to daily life, the presence of mundane technology in their novels. And the contention in the chapter is that these kinds of technologies are more than just props that say these novels take place, in the in the 21st century as kind of evidence of when they're happening, but that they're doing something else. So I had a look at 4 novels. So people here, I'm sure, will be familiar with lots of them. So Elaine Feeney's As You Were, Sally Rooney's Normal People, Emma McBride's A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, and Anne Enright's Forgotten Waltz. And sometimes when I talk about these novels in this context, people say there is no technology. I don't know, now I feel nervous about to say this as it's being live streamed. I once had an argument with Roy Foster, who told me there is no technology in The Forgotten Waltz. And I said, well, I'm sorry to tell you. It's all about technology. So this idea that characters are communicating by email, all of these things that are sort of obvious in a way, or the jobs that they do, or their interaction with technology, what the chapter is arguing is that what that means is these kind of mundane technologies, these gadgets and machines, are the way in which characters are able to express their innermost feelings or their deepest thoughts. That it's actually through these mundane technologies that we see the real emotions, actually, very often, of these characters. So, for example, in Elaine Feeney's As You Were, Sinead, the protagonist of that novel, is able to ask Google the questions that she cannot articulate to the real people in her life. And there's a really powerful scene in the novel where she's in a hospital, she's been keeping her diagnosis from her husband, and he says, I bet you told Google you were dying before me. Right? So she has asked Google all the symptoms, how should she be kind of coping with this? So there's this kind of intimacy that she has with Google and her laptop and her phone that she doesn't have with her husband. There's also the idea in these novels that people can say things to each other via technology that they can't say face to face. So again, this is a risky and dangerously reductive reading of Normal People. I'm just going to toss out into the room, of all rooms. But when you look again at Normal People and you see that actually all of the failures of the relationship take place when they're trying to and failing to speak to each other, but the relationship works perfectly when they're apart and they can send each other these long, emotive emails, right? So there's a sense in which that's when it functions, because the technology, the mundane technology, mediates. It allows them to really kind of be a different version of themselves. In the chapter, there's an idea that it's because it's so mundane, this technology, that it's disarming. That's the kind of place where maybe, as I've said, this kind of intimacy can take place, or these kind of revelations take place, because we're almost not noticing that it's there. So I guess to sort of wrap up my kind of little bit of this, really, the other thing that James asked us to do is to think about where the chapter might lead to in terms of future work, or maybe what it opens up, what's not done in the chapter. So when I think about this, I think it's maybe particularly important thing for people who are thinking about, and scholars of contemporary Irish writing, because there's an obvious way in which it can't be ignored, right? So that contemporary novelists need to think about how to deal with technology. So it necessarily impacts the plot of novels, right? People can't really get lost because they could look at a map on their phone. They can't really not communicate with others quickly because they've got that capacity. What do they do with that in a sort of practical sense? So my question is really, what are the opportunities, what are the dilemmas that kind of presence of mundane technology is going to present to writers and those of us who are studying them? I might put that in a different way, and to say, how do we think about how we read technology? So to go beyond just noticing it and saying, look, all of these people are playing video games or they are texting each other, but to think about ways in which we analyse the kind of presence of that technology. So one of the things I really love about the way that Elaine Feeney uses technology in As You Were is that she also notes the kind of voice, if you like, of the machine. So in the text, we see the typing, not typing, the kind of presence of the three dots of what the message might be, the message that doesn't come through, the kind of absence in the text of the message that is never received. So all of those things that we need to kind of be able to read the technology and read the text at the same time, to understand what that means, to know what that signifies to the characters. There's a sense in which these kind of mundane technologies are also the place where contemporary fiction is produced, right? So contemporary writers are producing these novels on computers, obviously enough, and more often than not, people are also consuming contemporary fiction through the kind of devices in their pocket, or on the bus or on the train. So what does that do as well to our reading? And then I guess that kind of final point that I hope is present in the chapter and is something that I'm kind of continuing to think about is this kind of sense in which it's very easy, and Margaret's already kind of alluded to this idea that somehow art and technology are these kind of distinct things, but also the idea that technology can be perceived as kind of emotionless somehow, and kind of from the machine rather than from the person. So the thing I'm really interested in these novels and others like them is that the relationship with the technology, with the device, is a really emotionally charged relationship. So that kind of dependence, or as I'm trying to argue in the chapter, this kind of consoling presence, the consolation, to actually feel made better by the technology, the kind of comfort of having the phone in the hand, because, for example, the phone is not the device so much as the connection to the person on the other end of it, right? So the email is not the thing itself, it's the opening the laptop, opening the message from the person who you want to hear from. That's where that comes from. And how is it that novelists are able to, or are going to, engage with this idea to sort of take the mundane and make it meaningful?
Thank you very much, Claire. Our next speaker is Anne Carrio, and as I said, I'll wait till the end for questions and responses because there's just so much there. And Anne's chapter takes two topics that are sometimes seen as opposites, poetry and technology, and explores the relationship between the two in the contemporary Irish context in a really interesting and innovative way. So, Anne, if you wanted to talk about that.
Thanks very much, Jodie. I just want to start by saying that the volume here is quite special to me also in the sense that I noticed that I've started carrying it around with me, not just because I feel like a proud parent, but it has become a reference book for me because it covers such a range of topics that whatever aspect of literature and technology in the Irish context I start thinking about, there's some way in. I feel there's some way in through this volume, not always specifically in the context of digital technologies, which is my specific area of interest, but historically as well. So it really says something how valuable I find it to my work in terms of teaching and research. So yes, my own essay focuses on poetry, contemporary poetry. So all the poems have been written all the poems have been written around or after the turn of the millennium, and specifically on data, poetry and data. Data as something that is many and specific instances and records and things, but also that is one, as in one mass of almost like the material with which we engage that happens all the time, is accumulated and stored and exchanged and questioned. But we're trying to deal with a situation where we're talking about very small things that are very many and one mass of data that is quite hard to grasp. So in this sense, poetry kind of becomes a form of word processing or language processing that can interrogate that whole process. So it's both formal and thematic, the question about engagement with data in these poems. So there are quite a few poets that I discuss here, and there were more in earlier drafts, and this whole thing was becoming quite a monster. And then I cut some poets out, and I was reading this essay yesterday to get a sense of what on earth I ended up saying and thinking that felt that there were omissions here that I now maybe regret as well, but maybe that leaves some scope for that future work that we were talking about. But I think it's also a product of the pandemic situation, not only in terms of my own work, sometimes carried in the attic of a house in rural Cavan with no connection whatsoever. But like we've become aware of how data is relevant, how the data economy is not disconnected from all these other aspects of cultural production, all these other thematic engagements and so on. So not just the actual practice of everyday life, but how it connects or doesn't with the whole infrastructure and system beneath. And almost all of these poets engage with that tension or discrepancy in some manner. So I looked at the work of Paula Meehan, Derek Mahon, Justin Quinn, Paul Muldoon, Peter Sir, now I have to bluff because I'm a bit nervous, Raymond Healy and Billy Ramsell, who all approach this topic from slightly different angle. So it's considered a selection of poets, but also very, very small part of a snippet of what's out there. I talked to a contemporary Irish poet who I shall not name here now, not to put her on the spot, a few years ago, 8 or 9 years ago, and talked about what I'm writing about, digital technologies and poetry, and in poetry. And her first reaction was that I don't think there's too much of that around. And there was probably more than she thought even then, but there certainly has been a huge shift towards a closer engagement. This idea that technology and digital media and data are not something that are oppositional to poetry or poetic practice, but there's also almost a responsibility to bring poetic language and this kind of language that consists of data or engages with data or becomes data and the systems that go with them. So quite a few of these poets are somewhat critical, hesitant, or even mournful when it comes to digital media and technologies. Paula Meehan and Derek Mahon, in particular, there's almost a sense of kind of dejection or nostalgia or even dystopian fear in some of these poems. But even Derek Mahon and Paula Meehan are not quite as exclusively critical as it might seem at first reading. Paula Meehan's written this longer poem on future Dublin, 100 years from now, taken over in the new age of new machines. And it is quite a scary thing to read because it is very, very much focused on the current moment, the early 21st century moment, as the moment when things started going in a certain direction. But despite this, it gives us the sense of technology is not something that happens to us. It is something that we are a part of forming, and we should be, and this is where the importance of humanities and literary scholarship comes in. It's not necessarily the way it is, or it doesn't have to necessarily become this kind of dystopian situation. And I think that's where the value of poetry and literature and other forms of cultural production comes in. And Derek Mahon, who famously used his typewriter very, very long and wrote this wonderful essay on Olympia and the internet, is somewhat self-deprecating in his aversion to digital media technologies, but also aware of there are occasional hints to poetry and experimentation in the literary domain that happens because of the internet, that uses these new media. So there is a sense and awareness that this is not all there is to it. Paul Muldoon, I feel, is like fish in water in this environment, in the sense that there was always this element of suspicion to anything that purports to present a whole narrative or view or picture. So that element of playful doubt is something that is quite, it's almost like a tool or framework through which he approaches digital media as well. Peter Sear's poem that I look at, it talks about Dublin and the idea of creating a perfect record, a perfect archive, or perfect map of Dublin through new technologies that has every single thing, this kind of growing hunger by the mapmaker to represent the entire city, and then it ends up in this situation where he's feeling the floor with his fingertips because every single detail has to be there. So there's bodily engagement, but also the closer you go, the more impossible it becomes. And then Ramsell's work, where code and DNA and Healy's work as well are considered as related to each other. So it is a bit of a kind of collection of different approaches, but I think it says a lot about how quite a few Irish poets have kind of risen to the task or to the challenge of employing their own medium or their own technology of poetry to engage with this situation. So I think that's, I could go on, a whole captive audience here, but I suppose one of the things that I find quite interesting, and Justin Quinn's work has engaged with this, is this idea that technology and ecology and the whole global system are increasingly, we're aware increasingly how they're intertwined. They always were, but now there's an urgency to understanding this. So the poems that kind of break those barriers between technology and biology and literature and data technologies are the ones that are kind of drawing me closer all the time. And how to engage with that kind of very small scale and microscopic and global view, and the shift to scale is something that I'm interested in. And as you probably realize, it's quite a big topic to tackle, but I think poems kind of create this, kind of bracket these moments of calm or focus in this kind of situation where we are bombarded with different, with information and different material all the time. So poetry is quite suited for this kind of critique or cultural engagement in that respect. So I think, yeah, I will stop now.
I think anybody who was at the seminar on AI and safety, AI and ethics this morning would see a lot of parallels with, and also the necessity of literature and culture being brought into that discussion. I love technology isn't something that happens to us. I don't think I actually need to introduce Kathryn Wade, who is our next speaker, to a lot of people in the room. She's our colleague in the Centre for Cultural Analytics at UCD and has contributed here to the chapter on again, a topic very dear to my heart, the Feminist Digital Archive in Ireland, which she co-wrote with Margaret, and I think no better women, actually, I was about to say, than to comment on this topic. So I'll hand over to Kathryn.
Thanks so much, Geraldine. So yes, Margaret and I co-authored this paper, and 2 years ago, which is around this time actually, 2 years ago, when Margaret first suggested to me that we should work together on this chapter, we had a fairly broad concept of what the paper was going to involve. So it was basically going to be some kind of a discussion of the intersection of feminisms and technologies in an Irish context, which, as you can imagine, could be quite a lot of things. And we had quite a lot of very enjoyable conversations about what shape this work might take. And I think we had some quite different ideas initially, and we managed to bring everything together to make to create a chapter which we decided to title Irish Literary Feminism and Its Digital Archives, with an optional S at the end, which was essentially a history of some of the key digital interventions in Irish feminism. And I say some, advisedly. So the overall goal, which I do think we achieved, was to provide a consideration of the lives of these digital engagements and their afterlives, and also the contexts within which they came into being. So just to talk a little bit about the collaboration, which I hope is a fair assessment of how it went. Our sections are very enmeshed, and it is very much a joint effort, but it is broadly possible to identify the work of two discrete hands. So Margaret's part of the chapter provides a very thoughtful and considered outline of the history of Irish feminist recovery projects, digital and otherwise, and the digital ones in particular that we looked at were the WIMIC resource, the Women's Writing Online, the Munster Dictionary of Women Writers, and the Lober Guide to Irish Literature Online resource. And it also highlights the critical importance of volumes 4 and 5 of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing as what I believe is your quote to say, as a landmark moment in this movement, which I wholeheartedly agree with. So we identify Field Day as an important precursor for Irish digital feminist projects. And just a quote that I want to provide is that its 2002 publication coincides with a widespread move to database and hypertextual modes, particularly in relation to large-scale bibliographical projects, which are really beginning to become sort of commonplace and really, really extensive at that point in time. And we also trace then the lineages of several of those projects. And Margaret also then makes what I believe is a very important and very timely call for greater attention to issues surrounding access, preservation, and longevity in digital projects, which is a perennial problem since the onset of humanities computing. The road is littered with deceased good works, unfortunately. So my contribution to the chapter was to set out quite a specific understanding of the utility of the massive digital archive for feminist literary work and for other forms of scholarship to which these archives have been put. And this is to say, I understand them as archives being always contingent upon the historical circumstances of their formation, and that sort of in contradiction to how some of the creators of massive archives, such as particular Google Books and the Internet Archive, would sort of portray them. They're better understood as capacious rather than universalizing. They don't contain everything. There are always important lacunae. And they should be considered as sources of data rather than knowledge, which must be provided by close and informed reading, and which will always in itself be bounded by current states and modes of understanding. So from a personal perspective, I was very happy to have the space to make this specific argument, which really underpins a lot of my own research, my own work, and which I have expressed in a sufficient number of settings outside of print that certain of my colleagues have called attention to it in other talks and so forth. But it is a very important point that I was delighted to have a space to make in print. And also, I really felt that it had found an ideal situation within this consideration of Irish feminist scholarship, which as a discipline has long been concerned with the questioning of origin myths, and with examining who's allowed to speak and whose words are deemed worthy of recording and archiving. So throughout the chapter, we also emphasize the importance of historicizing the Irish feminist networks and lineages of pre-existing scholarship that underpin these digital projects. And we argue that they are worthy of consideration, both in their own right and as models for future collaborative digital work. In itself, the chapter is a collaboration. So I was really happy to be able to cite valuable work which had been done by a number of my colleagues working in Irish feminist and digital cultures. I was really struck by just the number of people I know personally who have written work that was, I felt I had to cite. It was just really relevant to what we were trying to say. I was delighted to actually be able to quote an interview with yourself, Geraldine, which had been done with Deirdre Flynn as part of the Irish Women Writers Network. It just dovetails so nicely with all of these things. And I love to get an anecdote in, particularly the one about you kicking the scanner.
Yep, nobody ever came after me, so, you know.
The scanner is probably decommissioned now. So, but this was in a discussion of the embodied labour that goes into the work of creating the digital archive, which is now and also historically often done by women, which is really foundational to the work of any kind of mass digital scholarship. So I was also really pleased and not at all surprised when I reread the edited collection by the degree of synchronicity between our chapter and some of the others in the work. And I was particularly struck by an argument made by Kathryn Conrad in relation to how Irish modernists relate to technology, that technologies, including technologies of the word, both mediate human experience and are necessarily embedded in larger systems that cannot be simply ignored or evaded. So this not only describes a thread which runs throughout the book as a whole, I think I'm correct in saying, but it also speaks directly to our work on digital archives, which can absolutely be considered a form of technologies of the word. So just rereading this chapter 2 years on from the initial conversations that took place in the winter of 2021 when we began work, I'm really struck by how much the world has changed and yet how relevant the arguments that we were making still are within an information and cultural landscape that is currently very much preoccupied with the potential benefits and pitfalls of artificial intelligence systems. So since we first began work on this chapter, as everyone here is very aware, I would imagine, artificial intelligence has really become mainstream. It was definitely around in many forms and indeed accessible in some manners, but it has really suddenly become part of the public consciousness and in everyday use by a lot of people, in just members of the public in addition to industry and government bodies worldwide. And valid concerns have been raised about the extent to which unsupervised AI is utilized, often in ways that are not transparent or are poorly understood for decision-making and analytical processes, not to mention its encroachment into scholarly and creative fields. And I think following on from this morning's session on AI and society, there's also a kind of existential fear in the mix there, which I'm not going to address. That's another day's work. And also I was really struck by your comment on how appropriate Paula Meehan's kind of poem and the notion that technology is not something that happens to us, but that we're involved in the shaping of, really, in fact, almost echoes something that the speaker, Professor Stuart Russell, said today, which is that he actually called for the real importance of people working in the humanities and social sciences for helping shape the way that we continue to develop and especially regulate artificial intelligence technologies. So I'm going to be on AI for just a minute longer, so bear with me. Without venturing myself into alarmist territory, what I want to speak to is the fact that it's been amply demonstrated that AIs are as good as the data sets on which they have been trained. And that they have an overarching tendency to emphasize and exacerbate human error, human bias, and in some cases deliberate human mischief, such as an instance in 2016 in which the latest chatbot called Tay, who was developed by Microsoft, was deliberately and maliciously radicalized by internet users and began producing racist, misogynistic and violent rhetoric within hours of its release at a pace which a human troll could only dream of. This is basically the data sets that we create, that we build systems on, are really subject to they're no better than we are. And an example that's kind of more relevant to this particular discussion that I want to cite is there were attempts made during the pandemic to create an artificial intelligence system to help identify cases of COVID from patient records, which is a really laudable goal. And despite the genuine efforts of the medical professionals working on these projects, it was really hampered by the uneven quality and the inconsistent labeling of the data sets on which these systems were built. So what happened was the AI was able to identify patterns in the data, but not to determine which patterns were of medical significance, with the result that in some cases, for example, it began to fixate on the fonts which were used by different hospitals in their reports. And to quote the MIT Technological Review, fonts from hospitals with more serious caseloads became predictors of COVID risk. So how do we get from medical AIs to feminist digital archives? I promise we'll get there. So my point here, and now and always, is that all data sets and all archives are shaped by the circumstances of their construction, and that now more than ever, it is imperative for all forms of scholarship and research that we know our data intimately. I love your concept of the intimate and the mundane, and I think we have to start thinking about the data that we make and that we use in the same way. And that it's also imperative that we actively continue to examine and understand the archives that we're using and creating, both for our own work and for the other uses that they might be put to, which are increasingly beyond our control. So this applies really whether the goal is to sort of fully and accurately represent the history of Irish literature or to create potentially life-saving medical systems. They're all part of the same continuum now. So just to return to my my kind of my Irish feminist training, to an article by Patricia Coughlin from 1991, which I always feel is just so it's just so key to my own research practice. I wind up citing it fairly often. This is Bog Queens. Again, study of a formative study of Irish poetry. The point that Coughlin makes is that a responsible criticism must seek to uncover the moment of construction. And what she's referring to here is the moment of construction of the poetic speaker, who, as she argues, is a fictional construct of an authoritative, nearly always male voice, whose authority is reliant wholly or in part on the elision of other voices, in this case, the voices of the women about whom the speaker is speaking. And if it isn't doing an injustice to Coughlin's work, I want to make a comparison between this authoritative, constructed Irish male poetic voice and the sort of equally fictional construct of the all-encompassing digital archive. And just to argue that we should consider how each of these entities constructs its authority and what is obscured when we accept them unquestioningly. So there's a huge potential in digital scholarship, both on the massive and on the small scale, for illuminating and liberatory work, once we are confident that we understand the foundations that we are building our work upon. So just to kind of speak a little bit to the notion of where this work might go, I have a lot of ideas for my, my own future directions for this. I'm particularly enthused at the notion of the technologies of the word and how digital archives kind of are enmeshed with that. I started out in internet studies, and I just keep moving further back in time. I've become much more interested in book history now, so it's the technologies of the word is a lovely encapsulation of that notion. But overall, for the chapter, what I hope it would help support is critical work that uses feminist digital archives, both small and massive, in order to reconsider current assumptions about the primacy of specific writers and movements, to rediscover lost voices and perspectives, and to examine the mass digitized archive as a subject worthy of criticism in its own right, as a technology of the word with its own history and lineages. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks. I'm going to hand over finally to my accomplice. No, you have nothing?
Happy enough to to leave it to the floor, I think, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, I had a lovely link there about the fact that she also kicked that scanner. I'm sorry, it wasn't just me.
Yeah. Well,
It wasn't just me.
I will then absolutely rise to the invitation just to finish that story. And it does link with working on Field Day. I had the great pleasure of being I'm trying to remember the terminology, a contributing editor to a series of which Georgine was general editor. It was, we were certainly moving away from one guiding editorial, what would you say, voice. But it did involve using a scanner in in a basement in UCD that I couldn't find to this day. And we were so pleased because we were using OCR. Now, what we didn't realize for the first time is there were so many errors in the OCR that it would have been much quicker for us to just input it ourselves. But you could guess Georgine and I weren't going to take the easy, quick route. We were going to use the technology. But the U and V were, indistinct. Most T's didn't have the full part of the letter. You remember it well, all the problems. But it was so exciting, Georgine. And we persevered. So you may want to add to that story, because I can't quite remember the moment when you kicked the scanner.
Maybe the moment when I figured out we would have been quicker typing it. But the thing used to stick, so it needed a helping hand. It's interesting, one of our PhD students in the centre who isn't here today, Xiu Hao, has been doing work on what he describes as historical OCR. And I mean, that was the history we lived. And they are now able to he's working on automating that, to correcting that. But I think this is something, that connection between the feminist project in Ireland and the development of digital humanities is kind of unusual. On one level, there was a debate in, I think it was the LA Review of Books a couple of years ago, where it became immediately apparent that the idea that the digital humanities wasn't a critical space and wasn't attentive to marginalised voices was immediately challenged by African-American scholars, people who were working on archives of slavery, people who were working in local histories. And so I think this idea that the digital space, which is so dominated, and we had a lot of discussion of that this morning, how it's so dominated by a couple of companies, but there's also this kind of guerrilla space where people take the affordances that are there and make something different out of it. And the mainstream presses were not immediately hospitable to Irish feminist scholarship 20 years ago. So we took what we could get and we kicked it into shape, I think is the answer to that. I want to open up this discussion to the floor because it's been such rich presentations. I'd be really keen for people to get a chance to engage with that. And could I ask anyone who asked the question, Connor's going to come around with the microphone there, because we have people online and they can't hear you unless you use the microphone. I think there's somebody just there, Connor. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm fascinated. I come from a tech background as a mature student, but then I started writing because the tech industry was so threatening in that it's highly dominated by a male, white, rich type of individual. Even when I returned to college as a male student, there was 4 women in the class, and that was only 20 years ago. And it wasn't even, we weren't even remotely considered when it came to the tech industry picking us for interviews, especially not me, I was older. And I ended up teaching individual database management systems, and as your conversation, the average database management system is only as good as the human that built it, because most of them are built in different languages, historic, and they don't speak to each other anymore. So all of that, and that's what AI is based on, and most of it's robotics. If you read AI, when it's regurgitated from the amount of services out there, which all our electricity is being used for, we're going to be in the dark shortly. It comes out very robotic, and it's pretty obvious, and the average academic can probably see it. And I also think that a lot of women have been written out of the tech industry from the woman who originally developed coding to, if you look at Bletchley Park in World War II, the majority of women who broke the coding and probably helped to stop the war, or that's probably a bit of a, but most of them were women, and most of the coding was done by women, and the problem solving, because obviously women think differently, but they're not allowed to be part of the bigger picture. I just find that it's pretty strange that it's still going on. But what I also find on another level is recently, and most people, I mean younger people would probably associate with this, is that the Department of Education recently has decided to ban phones for younger children. And while I did teach some younger children, and it is irritating children out with phones in the classroom, I think it's dangerous banning phones for anyone in this technological world. And I think rather than educate children how to use their phone, and maybe take the phone off and put it in a box outside the classroom, as opposed to a word of banning. If you ban anything, a child will, if you say to your child, you can't go out, they'll get out the back room window, they'll get out the bedroom window, they'll find a way of getting around it. It's an impossibility. I also think it's dangerous for a government department to start telling parents what to do with their children.
I was going to say, can we take maybe 2 or 3 questions and get you to answer them maybe collectively? I'm just thinking, keeping an eye on the time. Does anybody else want to? Ben? Sorry, take yourself there. Do you want to? Yeah.
Excuse me. Well, I thought this was a great presentation. I have a couple of questions. I'm both a book historian and a digital humanist, and I've been the editor of 18th Century Studies, the major journal in the field in the world. And you know, one of the things that Annette brought up about the Feminist Archive I thought was kind of interesting is the problem of textual fixity, as we call it. And I can give you an example of this. This is a concept from Elizabeth Eisenstein in printing. She says, you know, in the 16th, 17th century, textual fixity was you could count on every copy of a 500-run book having identical typography on each page. But when we have the internet, we don't. The example for this is when I was writing a recent book for Oxford on slavery, there's a database in Medford, just outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that has some slave trade letters, some orders to a ship captain. They said one thing a couple of years ago, when I was putting this together, 2018, and then when I went back to them last June to write a paper I was giving in Galway, they had been changed. And it was almost, and they were supposed to be, you know, typographical transcriptions of letters from the 18th century that were written in Salem, Massachusetts. And so, you know, how does that, I guess was the first question, how does that like jeopardize the idea, oh, we're going to create this great digital archive? And like, are we all going to have to just end up going back as scholars when we're writing and try to get the proper citations to go back to the hard copies of these things wherever they are in the world? I mean, it's great that, you know, I can access anything from on my computer, any kind of digital archive. But, you know, this problem of textual fixity, that someone can, you even mentioned it, sometimes people can hack a website like that. Yeah.
Any other questions to take? Okay, I have a few of my own, so I'll keep those in reserve. So to come back to that, I mean, the 2 issues there. One is gender and technology, but also unequal access. And the other is this, you know, a really profound question actually for historic and military scholarship, which is the instability of digital editions. And I mean, some of what you were talking about, it comes up, I think we all encounter this, where we go back for something. And things like a Wayback Machine offers you a way of trying to retrace the steps. But I'm not sure if there is a complete technological solution to this. I mean, other people may have other views on it. But it seems to me that at least one of the issues is that there isn't as yet a protocol for maintaining digital editions. We are not treating them with the respect that they need to be treated with. Does anybody want to address any of those issues that have come up so far?
Could I just make an anecdotal addition to the conversation? There was a Digital Humanities and Culture conference in Galway, as well a few years ago, and somebody quite prestigious was opening it, but for a different generation, and who was talking about how wonderful the digital domain is, that now I can preserve things in digital formats and make them available for future generations, and told how he had himself digitized material. I can't remember if it was photographs, records, or something else, after which he could throw all the other stuff away with a sense of pride. And you could hear the collective groan from the back row of the researchers in digital humanities and culture, specifically for the two reasons. There's the question of digital obsolescence, and secondly, the process of selection of every single remediation and making of new record is also involves decisions of what exactly is preserved and what is thrown out. And if you make that decision once and throw the material away, then it's, that's what you have. So there was a kind of two-side problem there, a two-sided problem there that seemed obvious to some people and not to everybody. But it was made as a good spirit and as a positive comment. But I think these issues are. Yeah, Margaret.
And I'm just thinking, actually, I suppose one thing that links both what Sean and Laura said, the other side, I suppose, of the lack of fixity is also the obsolescence. Laura, you made the point about different languages, of things not being able to speak to each other, and I think that's... yeah.
Like, I would build something differently to someone in India.
Absolutely.
And the language and culture.
Absolutely. And yeah. Yeah, and I suppose the example I was thinking of in myself, that I still carry with kind of, I suppose, a amount of shame is just, the projects being, not so much obsolete, but not available. So the digital edition of the Lober Guide is still not available, even though Karen and I went back and forth about trying to phrase a footnote that would still allow it to be a possibility in the future without being fraudulent and saying it was available. And it's still, then I thought, the publication of the volume, we'll have fixed it by then, and it's not fixed. So this is my public declaration. But it is a wider issue. As Karen, you put so well, the road is kind of, what did you say, paved with many projects that are no longer available, and that makes us all. It's another side of that. It's so. I don't know. I'd welcome people's advice on this. Yeah.
Oh, I think this is future steps. I mean, I think there's a big. This is feminist retrieval projects. Yeah. 2.0, not just finding what was written and what was and who wrote it, but this time round retrieving all the work we did to find them in the first place and making it available all over again, because there's a huge problem with obsolescence of technologies, but there's also a huge problem with the funding models, where the funding is not there to maintain sites, and I think that's a huge part of the problem.
If I could make one last point on that, and I'll stop then, because you've just reminded me, my colleague for many years in Maynooth, John Keating, made a really good point about that some years ago, where he said, what kind of tech company would, produce a product and the moment on its launch withdraw any funding for its development and support. And I thought it's a really good analogy. That's what happens all the time with digital projects, that all of the funding is to open them.
Yes.
So thanks for the reminder, Geraldine. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's something that, as we have these conversations about AI, this sort of speed of technological development, which is creating this accelerated obsolescence, and I don't want to get into an easy, the previous edition of an 18th century poem is always going to be there, or a 17th century document, because it could be burnt, it could be lost, somebody could put it in a leaky basement. So that I think that permanence of books is partly legendary, but there is something to it. If you can open the book, then it's the text is still there. Whereas I think this idea of something quite ephemeral probably also feeds the thing that you were talking about, Claire, where people have this sense that communication via electronic means is somehow fleeting or less real. Whereas the experience of this mode of communication is in many ways more intimate than, say, putting a letter in the post or whatever.
Yeah, and maybe the question, and this maybe speaks to the first point as well, which is how different it really is when it comes down to it. So one of the things kind of quoted in this chapter is just, an interview with Sally Rooney where she says, when I'm emailing my friends, that's my real voice. And that's the real voice I'm trying to then put into the novel. When sometimes someone has said something just perfectly for your argument,
I love that.
you just think, thank you. You're saying that exactly, I knew it. Right, so, and it maybe kind of speaks to that point as well about whether things are, I'm kind of cautious about saying whether things are generational so much as kind of personal, really. But it's revealing in this bigger conversation that all of the novels I have examined here are all by women. So there might be a sense in which that kind of the way those technologies are used by Irish women writers is particularly kind of, kind of full of possibility maybe. And so there's a sort of way in which analysing how that's kind of working in fiction, there's a lot more for us to kind of ask, really. Yeah,
I was just thinking of the first section of The Wren, where you have somebody using, the phone is and the laptop. This is a means of making a living, but it is also a means of fabricating a persona. It's an influencer, she's recounting their adventures in far-flung parts.
Yeah.
And that move in the novel towards her actually having adventures in far-flung parts, spoiler alert, is quite interesting.
Can you stop actually, because I'm halfway through it, so
sorry.
That would be a problem.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
But even in the kind of the interviews I've heard with Anne Enright talking about it, even thinking about how does she write the voice of the online influencer as much as she's writing the voice of the poet, so that kind of sense in which these technologically mediated voices in Irish fiction are a thing that we kind of can't just let sort of, go under the radar.
Could I get in quickly before the floor to ask Anne the question of who were the poets you would like to include in the next version? And sorry, I cut it.
Who was cut is what she's asking, Anne. Who was cut?
There are quite a few, some of whom I named briefly, but Trevor Joyce would be one obvious voice. Nick Laird has written absolutely wonderful work that is increasingly in that technology-nature interface, and engage with the kind of material environments and systems of communication. I'm trying to. It's almost like trying to decide who to leave out almost, and how and why, and there was the sense of some work not having technology in it or digital media technologies in it. I'm quite suspicious of that statement in any context, because the way in which we engage with the environment, the everyday world, is somehow informed by the way in which our everyday practice is shaped by technology. So whether there are direct references or exact mentions of digital media or a platform or some particular interface is not at all the whole story. So almost any poet would be engaging with digital media, and I guess other Northern Irish, Sinead Morrissey, Leontia Flynn, the list goes on.
Thank you. Yeah, Sinead Morrissey is really interesting, isn't she?
Absolutely, and through this media archaeological aspect that she created as contemporary technologies, through technologies and devices that have gone obsolete, like the mutoscope or early cinema and so on. So she has quite a historical awareness of how media have a political dimension as well.
We could turn this into a parlour game. I'm just thinking of Marconi's Cottage in Maeve McGuckian.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Conor, I think Katie has one last question there. I think we might give the last word to Katie, or the last question to Katie.
I just couldn't help when Claire gave her paper. I kept thinking about Dracula and how that is a text that the entire plot is driven forward by cutting-edge new technologies. So they have, I think I counted 5, typewriter, newspaper, telegram, phonograph, and trains, I think are the primary ones. And this is very much that progress narrative where that this collection sort of writing against this idea that the Dracula will be overcome by all these new technologies. So it's very much modernization and progress is overcoming a barbaric past. But it also made me think a little bit about how we talk about technologies in literature, its presence in literature. Because I think sometimes when you're reading 19th century literature in general, as a scholar of 19th century lit, is completely shaped by different technologies. And I think there's something, I don't know, I'm trying to, I guess, ask if you think there's a difference in how we should be approaching technology and its presence in contemporary literature, if you think that people do approach it in different ways, or if you think they're kind of overlapping ways between, I don't know, Victorian discussions of technology and the presence. I guess my question isn't fully formulated, but one thing I am thinking about is just how rapidly technology is evolving now versus in the past. Like, one thing with Sally Rooney's novels that always drive me a little bit crazy is, like, the new one that came out, I don't really think people communicate by email as much as now they do by WhatsApp and that sort of thing. So 13 years ago, I think people writing long letters long emails to keep in touch really made sense, but it doesn't now. So I'm just wondering if you think that there's, I guess, a gap between how it's evolving, how quickly it's evolving, and also how it's being written about and how we as scholars are approaching it.
Well, I think we're all looking at you for that one, Claire, yes.
So I think the thing that you're identifying, isn't it, is also how quickly the very specific points of what seems like cutting-edge technology, how quickly they become obsolete. So even if you read something like The Forgotten Waltz and you think, people have iPods, why have they got iPods? Right, that's right. Use your phone, right? So, you know, even those kind of that delineation that will keep it within a sort of 5 to 6 year kind of period of what is no longer sort of new. But equally, I think the way in which there's a reading of Dracula where all you see is the technology, and there's another where it's invisible, right? So I think that's also true in kind of contemporary fiction. So, you know, there was a review, I think, in maybe the New York Review of Books, or something like that, where a girl is a half-formed thing is described as being completely devoid of time, right? But he plays a very specific computer game that came out only on the Commodore 64. It's a new computer, it's the only computer that's available. So the opposite is true, right? If we read the technology, we know kind of exactly what's happening there. So I suppose one way that I was sort of wrangling with this question is whether technology is kind of the set or whether it's a character. So whether it's just kind of going on in the background of the novel, and we kind of sort of, the characters are sort of, you know, that's where the action lies, or whether there's something more significant about the way they're interacting. So I agree with you. I think that's sort of the difference between, and I think this is something also that I think Sally Rooney has kind of written about, is that the email kind of communication dates her as well, right? Or it dates her what mode of kind of communication with her peers. And so, yeah, it will be interesting to see how that kind of evolves, because, yeah, her novels are having to sort of catch up with that, really. And so there's still technological communication, but it's not long prose form. You know, in normal people, one of the things that happens is people also are paying for text messages still, so they're very cautious about logging in online in an internet cafe to send one text message back to your mum to say you're still alive, right? Which is, when I read those novels with students, they're like, why is this? What is happening here? I've sent 50 text messages since you started the lecture. You know, so I think those kind of things are useful to us because they historicise, but we have to know all of the sort of nuance and subtlety of it to really kind of to make it have any value in our reading. Yeah.
Thank you for an absolutely wonderful panel discussion, and for, you know, great kind of questions, which has kind of given that a whole other level as well. I think we have ranged, though I said we had more of a focus on the present. Technically, Karen actually went right back to the 6th century, because we went to Field Day. And, and we got all the way up to AI with, you know, I think we did a compendium there of all the Irish poets. And then this that sense of an unstable presence, I think, present, which is really interesting in the way the technology both dates everything, and at the same time it makes now a more unstable concept, because is it a historical novel because somebody's still on Facebook, right?
Yeah,
you know, so I think that's so on that thrilling question, I would invite you to join us for coffee before we reconvene for our keynote.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Hello everyone, welcome back, both those in person and those with us online, to the keynote of today's proceedings. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Kathryn Conrad, who's Professor of English at the University of Kansas. And I want to take a few moments to introduce to those of you who haven't met her before her many esteemed publications on Irish literature and culture, which read texts and social movements through several critical lenses, which include public sphere theory, cultural geography, affect theory, and surveillance studies. Professor Conrad's first book, Locked in the Family Cell, examined how gender and sexuality impacted Irish and Northern Irish national identities, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. I can certainly attest that it's a core critical study for many of the modules we teach in UCD, much cited by my own undergraduate and postgraduate students. Her work continued to engage powerfully and influentially with Northern Irish culture, including her study of the politics of visual culture and what she calls the visible political culture of mural photography and parades. In Professor Conrad's writings and surveillance studies, including the queering of surveillance, she's delivered an incisive critique of the public sphere and also provided us with new, very welcome conceptualizations of counterpolitics and, quote from Professor Conrad, a geopolitics of affection. Her most recent scholarship, one of the many reasons why she's here today, focuses on the role of technology in mediating human experience and shaping political and ethical relationships. With Colleen Person and Julie McCormick-Weng, she is co-editor of Science, Technology and Irish Modernism 2019, and I really do want to say, Katie, that collection was a real inspiration for James and my work. She's also the author of a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights for Education, published in Critical AI Volume 2, and she runs an occasional Substack blog called Pandora's Bot on technology and culture. She's also co-director of the AI and Digital Literacy Project in partnership with the National Humanities Centre and the Hall Family Foundation. And it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Katie back to Dublin.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking you and James and Geraldine for the kind invitation to come today. And it's both an honor and a really timely opportunity for me to draw together some disparate threads, and hopefully some threads from earlier, if you'll excuse the pun on the title, which you will be sick of by the end of this talk. I hopefully can live up to the title, which of course, as is the case so often, preceded my writing of it. So in order to make some of those connections, I want to start by just providing a little personal context. In the fall of 22, so last fall, after chairing my department through the pandemic, I was granted a semester of, a blessed semester of research leave, during which I promptly got the COVID virus I'd been avoiding for 2 years. But more relevant for today is that I had the time to explore ChatGPT, founded on the large language model GPT 3.5, as you probably remember, and I was able to explore that in some depth. ChatGPT didn't Of course, Spring fully formed from the head of Sam Altman. It was the culmination of years of research on cybernetics, neural networks, machine learning, and built in particular on the transformer model that was developed from the insights of a 2017 paper entitled "Attention is All You Need." It was also the outcome of years of data scraping and compilation and the human hours of crowd workers and gig workers in the global south, paid, for instance, up to 90 cents an hour in Venezuela and $2 an hour in Kenya to tag and annotate data. So, as I said, thanks to my leave, I had the time to spend hours, many hours at my family, much to the chagrin of my family, experimenting with ChatGPT starting in early December of 22, which culminated in the probably 10 workshops or presentations this year, a course this fall for first-year students on generative AI, and the blueprint that Margaret referred to. So how do these experiments in particular connect to Irish literature? At least one colleague has asked that of me, good-humoredly, so today's a maybe somewhat chaotic attempt to answer that question. I'm particularly interested in, as might be clear from my biography, technologies in context, technological mediation, and technology in relation to culture, both present and past. The book I co-edited with Colleen and Julie, Science, Technology, and Irish Modernism, troubles the notion that Irish revival writing and Irish modernism are as distinct as they've often been characterized with regard to their attitudes to science and technology. As we argued in that collection more broadly showed, Irish writers during that period shared a nuanced understanding of the impacts of science and technology. And that nuance with regard to technology in particular is explored, as we've heard, across a broader time frame and expanded in the volume we're celebrating today and that I'm very honored to be a part of. So we began the introduction to science, technology, and Irish modernism and our introductory essay with one of the more famous quotations that's inspired that sense of what Eve Patton has called Ireland's two cultures debate. So William Butler Yeats's infamous comment about science. As Colleen, Julie, and I wrote, since W.B. Yeats made his infamous proclamation in 1890 that the man of science is too often a person who has exchanged his soul for a formula, the anti-scientific and Luddite bent of the Irish literary and cultural revivals has been taken as a given. As Patton has suggested, Yeats, I think, a fairly clear source. For those who may not be able to see this slide clearly, let me focus on a few lines from Arnold that most of you here will probably know well. It is not in the outward and visible world of material life that the Celtic genius of Wales or Ireland can at this day hope to count for much. It is in the inward world of thought and science. What it has been, what it has done, let it ask us to attend to that as a matter of science in history, not to what it will be or will do as a matter of modern politics. It cannot count appreciably now as a material power, but perhaps if it can get itself thoroughly known as an object of science, it may count for a good deal, far more than we Saxons, most of us, imagine as a spiritual power. So as Colleen, Julie, and I continued in our introduction, Yeats's position reinvigorates that Arnoldian conviction, recoding Arnold's argument into an unabashed endorsement of the poet of great passions. Arnold's view of Irish incompetence in practical matters is reinforced then by Yeats's aesthetic philosophy, and it stands as an enduring stereotype that hinders a view of Ireland's centrality to scientific and technological discoveries and debates. Oop, oop. Nope, we're good. I want to point out here how often that any resistance to particular scientific and technological changes is read as incompetence. We use the term Luddite in our introduction, and as I just mentioned, but as I use it and return to it appropriately enough in a talk about sewing machines and text styles, and yes, you heard the intended pun there, and you will hear it a lot. I want to be clear what I mean. As LA tech columnist Bryant Merchant has argued in his new book, blood in the machine, the popular meaning of the term Luddite was shaped by the winners, so to speak, the new factory owners who suppressed the machine breakers. But those machine breakers were not, as they are often painted, afraid of progress or even inept users of technology. Instead, as Merchant points out, they were skilled technologists who were quite able to use the technologies at hand, like flying shuttles and other textile innovations, that helped them to do their work while still allowing them a living wage. The specific kinds of lace frames and other mechanical looms that were deployed at a particularly vulnerable economic moment during the Napoleonic Wars effectively undermined the apprenticeship system and left talented workers literally to starve. And the people who would eventually become Luddites actually began with language, with petitions. When they were not listened to, when government failed to regulate the new technology, when a small number of wealthy men exploited the moment to effectively dismantle the cottage industry model and help usher in the factory age, the workers took up the mantle of Ned Ludd and focused their wrath on the machines. Their tactics notably focused on specific property, not all machines, not all textile machines, and not on people, actually worked for a while, as some factory owners chose against more automation. But the entrepreneurs at the forefront of the movement away from well-compensated human work and toward more automated work that would benefit them responded with wrath against the human workers whose lives they disrupted. And in short order, machine breaking became a capital offense under which many lost their lives. This was a formative moment for labor, and indeed, one can see a line between the Luddites and the IWW's sabotage tactics a century later. Ireland, and perhaps particularly Northern Ireland, has had its own fraught history with textile industry and automation. And of course, James Connolly was one of the several founders of the IWW, but that history is not my main focus today. Merchant's book has the subtitle, The Origins of the Rebellion Against Big Tech. He's writing and promoting the book right now in the so-called current AI moment, in the context of the SAG-AFTRA strikes in Hollywood, where studios are resisting limits on whether they can replace creative workers at various levels with AI. Here's a recent comic about Luddism that also traces a line between Luddism and the present moment. I highly recommend it. It's available online. My students got a kick out of it, so if you want to use it as a short history, it's a good one. I'm starting today with a little labor history, but I also want to probe at some of the other reasons for resistance to particular technologies that intersect with questions of labor. To return to Arnold, I first want to note that Arnold suggests the value of Irish people primarily as an object of science at a time when science and technology were being yoked together, and also at one of the earliest moments of techno-determinism. At the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, science and technology, as I point out in my chapter for this volume, are starting to mean very different things that they meant at the start of the 19th century. And they were folded together into a techno-scientific worldview. This worldview arguably persists to this day, where STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are yoked together despite their differences, united in empiricism, and often in the educational instrumentalism their combination highlights. But what we see in the 19th century is when technoscience accompanies the birth of techno-determinism, a belief that technological evolution is inevitable, a belief satirized in Samuel Butler's Erewhon, to which I'll return briefly later. So one of the things I like about Brian Merchant's book is that it marks a moment before techno-determinism, before the assumption that technology evolves inevitably, before an assumption that technology was a juggernaut, a term that itself comes from a story of people sacrificing themselves willingly by throwing themselves under the wheels of Vishnu's carriage. In other words, it is a story of a time where people could imagine another path. Why, in the Irish context, might revival writers and cultural workers have thought it valuable to imagine another path? Yeats's own perspective gets oversimplified. As 50s critic Charles Glicksberg wrote of him, for instance, Yeats would go forth to do battle against the practical, the prudent, the logical, the scientific. This characterization, of course containing elements of truth, loses the nuance of Yeats's and many revival writers' and cultural workers' resistance and the context out of which it emerged. Yeats was interested in scientific naturalism in his youth, for instance, and remained interested in scientific epistemology. Reflecting on the philosophy of Bishop Berkeley in his later years, Yeats would write that, quote, 2 or 3 generations hence, where men accept the inventions of science as a commonplace and understand that it is limited by its method of appearance, no educated man will doubt that the movement of philosophy from Spinoza to Hegel is the greatest of all works of intellect, suggesting that his beef with science and the inventions generated by it was with the extent to which the limits of scientific epistemology were not recognized, and with the mischief that misrecognition of limitation in turn could bring about. I might offer a parallel between Yeats's relationship to science and Joyce's relationship to the Catholic Church. Both were, we might say, heretics rather than atheists, engaged with the core concerns but resistant to their particular manifestations and structures of power. To the latter, as Eve Patton has noted in speaking broadly of Irish writers or revival writers' pushback against what I would call a techno-scientific and techno-deterministic worldview, quote, the process of negation which the revival engendered must also be seen, of course, in the broader context of late 19th century nationalism and a strategic review of Ireland's recent past. The rhetorical severance of science and literature was intrinsically bound up with incentives toward Irish cultural distinction and concomitant disengagement from those intellectual and cultural practices identified with the hegemony of Protestant ascendancy and the interests of imperial expansionism. She continues, the comparatively early professionalization of Irish scientists resulting from systematic government funding for a series of scientific and technological ventures in Ireland served to consolidate the association of science with manipulative British policy, while individual contributions from Irish sessions of the British Association for the Advancement of Science to subjects such as mapping or statistics were seen to underpin imperial development, the fruits of research being visibly digested by the empire and not the nation. As I write in my chapter for Technology in Irish Literature and Culture, Irish modernism's interest in emerging technologies is especially founded on an awareness of the embeddedness of technoscience in the imperial military power that supports British colonial rule. This embeddedness is no less true of the current moment, and one of the things we heard this morning in the AI and Society panel is that even all of the regulation tends to exclude military and defense from regulation. So that's, I think, an important thing to note. The second point about Yeats in response to Arnold, in other words, is that his resistance was both to a totalizing technoscientific worldview as well as to the colonial gaze and the imperial machine. We might reframe this resistance as valuing the human and the local in the face of the imperial and economically exploitative, as imagining another path and resisting the supposed inevitability of so-called progress. Technology is not something that happens to us, as we heard earlier, that serve the interests of the already powerful and wealthy to the detriment of the average person. I can't help but see echoes today of certain strands of Irish cultural nationalism at the turn of the previous century in the struggle over ownership of data, of artists and writers, as well as indigenous communities taking up the flag of data sovereignty. So in other words, we're talking not only about valuing human labor, as with the Luddites, but a concomitant valuing of culture. And how culture was valued was important to Yeats, which is where style and form come together. Returning to his infamous science statement, I want to draw more attention to the element that I've highlighted here, and that's often overlooked when we take this quotation out of its original context. I object to the honest folklorist, not because his versions are accurate, but because they are inaccurate, or rather incomplete. What lover of Celtic lore has not been filled with a sacred rage when he comes upon some exquisite story dear to him from childhood, written out in newspaper English and called science? Yeats, in other words, was responding not so much to science per se, but to the relationship between the human experience on one hand and a particular style on the other, to the human experience of story versus the recording of specific text in a specific way. For him, newspaper English was a problematic technological form. That might be a weird thing to say. What do I mean by that? As I point out in my chapter, first of all, the first recorded use of technologia appeared in a Latin treatise on the liberal arts in 1607. We also see it used to refer to a systematic treatment of grammar by 1612. The connection of technology to language and the relationship between language and creativity shows up in both parts of the word. The techno can be traced not only to the Sanskrit prefix for to fashion and the Greek for carpenter, but also the Latin verb to weave, texere, the same root for the English noun text. So Yeats, unlike a lot of Irish modernists, didn't actually talk explicitly a whole lot about technology as we know the word today. But he was interested in the relationship between language and form in that original sense of technology. And he did use the word machine a few times to express what he saw as an ill-formed version of that relationship. So one of Yeats's few invocations of machinery is in the introduction to his 1888 Variant Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, where he writes that these folk tales are full of simplicity and musical occurrences for the literature of a class for whom every incident in the old rut of birth, love, pain, and death has cropped up unchanged for centuries, who have steeped everything in the heart, to whom everything is a symbol. They have the spade over which man has leant from the beginning. The people of the cities have the machine, which is prose and a parvenu. They have few events. They can turn over the incidents of a long life as they sit by the fire. With us, nothing has time to gather meaning, and too many things are occurring for even a big heart to hold. In this very Wordsworthian construction of the folk, I want to draw your attention to the technologies. The spade, which is a technology of human flourishing, in his view, versus the machine, which is a disruptive technology. I want to note, too, that in Samuel Butler's Erewhon, there's one fictitious writer who resists the techno-deterministic book of the machines that justifies the destruction of all technologies in that fictional land. That writer specifically evokes and celebrates the spade as evidence of what we might now call the cyborg-like extension of human capabilities that gave rise, in that writer's view, to human civilization. I mention this because Yeats, who, as we will see, had certainly read Butler, was keen to distinguish between different types of technology. Like Butler, though, he sees the potential of some of the tools we create to support human thriving. So with that, I'd like to place Yeats among the Irish modernists who were particularly animated by questions of form and style, and to return to the question of style, which I will admit was frankly much less interesting to me a year ago, before ChatGPT and the LLM revolution. As I mentioned in my chapter for this volume, Irish modernists saw technologies, lenses, and printing presses, bombs, and cameras as forms that shape how we understand and negotiate the world. I also suggest there that Irish modernists are formal theorists of a different sort. They say literary forms as technologies that, in the words of Peter Paul, mediate human experiences and interpretations of reality. They recognize, to use the language design theory popularized by Carolyn Levine, that all forms have different affordances or things they allow the user to do. And I would argue it's a defining characteristic of Irish modernist literature that they consider and engage those literary forms with other technologies. Such engagement is rarely simply enthusiastic or technophobic. As I've argued elsewhere, Irish modernism's ambivalence toward technology, and we've heard this already today, but I'll quote myself again, emerges not simply from a naive opposition to Victorian British materialism or resistance to change, but from a subtler recognition of how technologies, including technologies of the word, both mediate human experience and are necessarily embedded in larger systems that cannot simply be ignored or evaded. I also argue that the first wave of Irish modernists, or what I'll refer to, modernists engaged critically with technological forms by the end of the 19th century, setting them alongside literary forms and evaluating them as modes of perception, engagement, and mediation. Writers like Bram Stoker Oscar Wilde and W.B. Yeats. By the height of the European modernist period, Irish modernists like Joyce Beckett and Elizabeth Bowen would fully acknowledge that techno-scientific development was part of a larger network of forms that could not be so easily disengaged from literary form. And all recognize those forms, as I would argue, as organizing a situation of moral decision-making. So I hope you can see the ways I'm trying to bring together literary form with questions of technology. Irish writers in this period, I'd argue, often saw literary forms as more conducive to human flourishing than the other forms that were emerging. And I hope you can see the relevance to the current moment. We are amongst technologies that generate words that emerge from particular networks of labor, money, and influence. Anthropologist Kate Crawford has said that so-called AI is not only a technology, it's a registry of power. It's also a form in the sense that theorist Carolyn Levine uses it. Ooh, did I skip one? No. That's all right. We'll go back to there. You'll just have to hear me say it. All of the historical uses of the term form, despite their richness and variety, do share a common definition. Form always indicates an arrangement of elements, an ordering, patterning, or shaping. Here, then, is where my own argument begins. This is Levine, not me, with a definition of form that is much broader than its ordinary usage in literary studies. Form, for our purposes, will mean all shapes and configurations, all ordering principles, all patterns of repetition and difference. Why adopt such a broad definition? The stakes I want to suggest are high. It is the work of form to make order, and this means that forms are the stuff of politics. And later, she writes, form emerges as trans-historical, portable, and abstract on one hand, and material situated and political on the other. So form is exceptionally broad here, deliberately so. It captures technologies, literary genres, shapes. It can include not only the architectures of large language models or telecommunication networks or particular technological artifacts like the printing press, but also the genres produced by and within those forms. But I would say it's usefully broad, as Levine intends it. Different layers of form intersect and interact in interesting ways. And in her sense, textual style is form. It represents the particular ways that text is ordered and the implications of the environment out of which that particular order emerges. So to return to the title of my talk within this larger framework, another pun, of form as both abstract and material as having political implications, I want to consider Yeats' technology and style by way of Yeats's reflection on machines and style. When Yeats refers to machines, they're generally figured in negative terms as unidirectional, automatic, and atomizing. For instance, in his 1909 diary entitled Estrangement, and printed in its first edition not only in the Dial, but also by the Kula Press, Yeats writes that logic is a machine, one can leave it to itself. Unhelped, it will force those present to exhaust the subject. The fool is as likely as the sage to speak the appropriate answer to any statement, and if an answer is forgotten, somebody will go home miserable. You throw your money on the table and you receive so much change. Style, personality, deliberately adopted and therefore a mask, is the only escape from the hot-faced bargainers and the money changers. The machine here is depersonalized, automatic, independent of the human, and transactional. But it's Yeats's evocation of style as a counter to the machine that brings me to the most evocative, for me, of his uses of the word and the inspiration for the title of my talk today. In his 1922 autobiographical reflections, The Trembling of the Veil, he wrote, I listened with excitement to see how the audience would like certain passages of Arms and the Man. Oh, there we go. Just to distract you. That's Runway, gave me that wonderful clip. I've lost my place already. Okay, I hated it. It seemed to me inorganic, logical straightness, and not the crooked road of life. And I stood aghast before its energy, as today before that of the stone drill by Mr. Epstein or of some design by Mr. Wyndham Lewis. He was right to claim Samuel Butler for his master, for For Butler was the first Englishman to make the discovery that it is possible to write with great effect without music, without style, either good or bad, to eliminate from the mind all emotional implication, and to prefer plain water to every vintage. Cheers. So much metropolitan lead and solder to any tendril of the vine. Presently, I had a nightmare that I was haunted by a sewing machine that clicked and shone, but the incredible thing was that the machine smiled perpetually. Yet I delighted in Shaw, the formidable man. He could hit my enemies and the enemies of all I loved as I could never hit, as no living author that was dear to me could ever hit. So I thought you might enjoy some generative AI interpretations of the smiling sewing machine. It was very hard to get them to do it, but I did eventually get it. They would not give me Yeats being haunted by one, though, and I tried real hard. You can't help but notice that Yeats's exemplar of stylist writing is Butler, who in Erewhon satirizes evolutionary theory and contemporary anxieties about technology together by inventing a culture that's banned machines due to the fears that they'll evolve and take over. I can't say I disagree entirely with Yeats's assessment of the unmusicality of Butler, or that he does write to great effect. But the sewing machine smiles its way into the uncanny valley, not simply because it's a machine, but because it's a machine making logical, straight, mechanical work of something that he thinks should be organic and crooked. Of course, Yeats sees Shaw as the sewing machine, and he also associates Shaw with violence, however metaphorical in this case. The pun on textiles and textiles is apparent here too, and quite deliberate, I think. As Adrian Patterson writes in Stitching and Unstitching, Yeats' Material and Immaterial, Yeats was exposed to a textile revolution in the presence of William Morris and his family, as were his sisters, and for him, artisanal handcraft and textual production went hand in hand. As Patterson writes, Yeats's characteristic things include cloths that lift to reveal the world beyond, as in the veil of his autobiographies. But while lifting veils, he never neglected what went into making them. He continues, in Adam's Curse, the veil of the workshop is lifted, and sound and textiles are worked into a central allegory for the making of poetry. To articulate sweet sounds together is made poetry's defining project, stitching and unstitching this project's defining metaphor. Such poetic stitching recalls the Greek practice of rhapsodia, the art of epic recital by a rhapsode, an oral performer whom Pindar characterizes as a singer of stitched verse. Etymologically, a rhapsode is a sower of songs who selects and stitches together from memory or extemporaneously patches of his own or others' verse. Dreams, as opposed to sewing machine nightmares, in other words, belong to a different sort of textile. And I might just make a note here that the impetus for this talk came out of some work I did a few years ago, trying to think about these together, and think particularly about Yeats's relationship to his sisters. I would say Lolly and Lily probably would take issue with Patterson's argument that he always, he never neglected what it went into making them. We can talk about that later if you want, but just for interest of time, I'm focused primarily on Yeats, but also Yeats in this context, and I think this is an important context. And I love this as a textile representation of the relationship between textile and text, of the veil between dream and waking life. This is one of many trees that Lily would work. You saw one actually, I think I chose a different one. She worked many when she developed her own style later. And so this sort of, I might call this a moment of multimediation and collaboration and echoing of each other's work. So as I've repeated throughout, textile and textile are not mere puns. They align as forms of human labor as approaches to mediation between people, as metaphors for communion and communication. Yeats cared about deliberately chosen style as an expression of the human individual. The form that text takes, in other words, is essential to him. It's the difference for him between that machinic logic that, unhelped, will force those present to exhaust the subject. The fool is as likely as the sage to speak the appropriate answer to any statement. The difference between that and communicating truth or knowledge. So one might see Yeats's comment as yet another of his many moments of intellectual elitism, but in his comment about logic, I see more his passion for valuing the agency of craft. And I see echoes of what he is resisting, both in the sewing machine and in the machine of logic in our current generative AI technologies, particularly large language models. Large language models are stitchers together, for sure, but they do not stitch like rhapsodes, despite ChatGPT's argument. Even ChatGPT acknowledges it at some point there. Large language models aren't magic weavers, they are not singers, and they aren't communicators, in the sense that communication is any deliberate attempt to convey meaning. They're generators, logic machines, if you will, and they're also machines, as I've tried to suggest throughout, that do not exist in a vacuum. They were created by people who, on the whole, share a techno-deterministic and techno-eschatological worldview that is dismissive of the value of human creative work, except insofar as it can be disaggregated and reformed efficiently into new outputs. They're maintained by an army of gig workers disconnected from this overall vision, asked to flag and tag for pennies, and often experiencing PTSD for having to slosh through the worst of humanity's nightmares, far worse than the nightmare of a smiling sewing machine. So to think about large language models as generators of style, I want to remind us how they do that. The first step in that project is a deformation and a reformation of human creative output into data. As I've written elsewhere, language matters, and the use of the word data to describe what AI systems are trained on has implications for how developers, users, and regulators think about generative AI and its relationship to human creativity. Referring to and thinking about texts and images as data allows for deliberately alienating reductionism. First of all, using data to talk about literary texts and artwork suggests that all of the component parts are equivalent and discrete, like pixels. Further, employing the word data to talk about the texts and art scraped from the internet means divorcing them from their historical and cultural contexts. And ultimately, talking about human creations as data obscures both the creative process and the creators themselves. When human creative work is treated as data and then tokenized, it takes on a new form. And you don't have to read through all of this, but it does. This is ChatGPT's description of the relationship between data and tokens. When human creative work is recombined as tokens in a generative system in the particular ways that large language models do, the output of the model tends, as Lauren Goodlad, Victorianist and general editor of Critical AI, has put it, the center or high point of a bell curve. In the words of ChatGPT itself, the model's design and training encourage it to generate responses that are coherent, contextually appropriate, and what it has learned to be typical for the situation based on the data it was trained on. I hope it's clear that I'm using quotations from large language models somewhat ironically and self-consciously. The center of the bell curve is average, and the responses are plausible. Not factual, not truthful, but plausible. So I want to show, and if you look at this also, you'll see that there are lots of misspellings. But it was the best shot that it gave me of this particular prompt. So I want to just show you a few outputs from various models. This is from the more recent Perplexity AI lab. You can see from the very start that it's not right, but also a plausible response, which, I mean, I could talk for a very long time about fabrications, as I prefer to call them, rather than hallucinations, and the implications of the kinds of things that they fabricate. But for those following online, I'm just scrolling through some plausible and somewhat humorous responses to questions. I posed various LLMs on the topics I'm talking about today. Again, that the sewing machine is not in 1919. I'm sure all you Yeatsians know. Let's see, what else do I have here? There is no poem called A Shavian Nightmare. So I'm seeding it, obviously, with a particular, it's using the context that I provided to provide a plausible response to the question that I asked. And then maybe for kicks. Isn't that nice? It's very sure about what this poem contains. Very plausible, too. As you can see, the answers are logical, but they're not necessarily true in a big T true sense or a little t true sense. And stylistically, they're also plausible and average. Now, that said, and we were just talking about this earlier on the way over, about different writers who think that they're not reproducible, their style's not reproducible. Everybody knows that this is not on show, right? But it's an interesting approximation of Muldoon's style. So large language models can be pushed towards the tails of the bell curve, right? If the prompt pushes them towards those tails. But even then, they're the most plausible responses for that prompt. So the claims that they can get quirky are claims within the particular context, right, that we offer it. So again, to considering the politics of the form, broad as that so-called data set that they're trained on is, it's still limited to the work that's available to be scraped and tokenized. It leaves out anything historical or current that hasn't been digitized, which is quite a lot, and represents a more diverse collection than scraped data. So the plausible response and style is biased towards what has been datafied. To be scraped and tokenized is to be seen, of course, but in that Arnoldian sense of being seen and objectified and instrumentalized by the gaze of those who wield the technology, a double-edged sword, as Yeats realized and that we see echoed in data sovereignty advocates, whether they're digital and traditional visual artists in the global north or Maori language preservationists. Ultimately, in other words, the style of LLM outputs is not simply a matter of taste. You might love it, you might hate it, you might find it impressive, it is, but regardless, it's the stuff of politics, and as such, it's not neutral. To return to Patterson's characterization of Yeats, but while lifting veils, he never neglected what went into making them. What goes into making them matters. Let us also not neglect that, as others reap what we sow. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie, for a tour de force. And I mentioned earlier about how Katie's conceptual vocabulary resonates, textile, and I think that the times we live in, I'm particularly glad of human thriving and human flourishing, and they're just some of the many notes I took. I did mention at the beginning to Katie that we're lucky, thanks to Molly, that this talk and the earlier parts of today have been recorded, will be available on YouTube and also on Radio Molly, because I know this is a talk to which I want to return more than once. So grateful, Katie. Thank you. So much. And the sewing machine is unforgettable.
That will be burned in your nightmares.
A collective haunting. We have a couple of minutes for questions or comments, so welcome any that you'd like to make. Geraldine, and I'll chair loosely.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, and thanks, Connor.
I was admonishing other people to use the microphone, and now I forgot. Thank you so much. There's just so much there. And I have two completely contradictory responses, which I think is probably a sign of how good the paper is. The sewing machine, in that specific context of Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th century means something completely different if you're a woman trying to make a living. Right? And I mean, Angela Burke has talked about this in the context of Bridget Cleary. The woman with the sewing machine has economic power. The dressmaker and this idea. So they're women who are making things in a completely different context to the Eight Sisters. And it was so good to see those beautiful images. But there is a sense, I'm always suspicious of Yeats. I can't stop being suspicious. Yeah, you know.
Sorry I've given so much time, actually, at some level.
You know, I enjoy him, but I'm suspicious of him in equal measure. And the rejection of modernity is also a rejection of a type of liberation from particular roles. And the other thing, and this comes back to your point about ChatGPT and the way in which the labour of tagging, the labour of digitising is made invisible.
Yeah.
And sometimes not even paid. Some of what they're using was done as labours of love for people in terms of digitising content. And I think this idea of where labour is, where gender is, where class is, and how it's obscured, on the one hand in beautiful images, and on the other hand in ugly and derivative prose, you know, this is something which, I'm not quite sure if this is formulated to a question, but how do we think about all of that in this new, strange, and maybe not so new, strange, not so strange world?
That's a great point about the sewing machine, and I think one of the important things, I mean, it becomes a great metaphor, right? But Yeats, I mean, Kansas has a number of letters, and including some hilarious ones where Lolly is sort of ripping on Yeats for not helping in any way, like physically not being there and just expecting, you know, the women to do the work. And so in the longer version of this project, I mean, that's really an important part of it. And I think the question I kind of want to come back to is less what the particular, whether he's right about the sewing machine as some sort of actual tool of labor, but I'm thinking of it more as a metaphor. But I think it kind of goes back to the Luddites, right? There were plenty of technologies that served people well. And to me, the question is, who does it serve? And what do we want the future to look like? And who gets a role in that, and whose labor is acknowledged, right? So the Luddite connection is you know, it's appropriate because it's textile laborers, but it's also, I think it's a question for now, right? I have computer scientists in my class, and you know, one of the things I said is, how do you feel about, you know, you're excited about the potential for something like ChatGPT and other large language models to write code, but you're also, you know, you're spending a whole lot of money to learn how to code. What will that mean for you? And the point I'm making to them is not to scare them, but to say, this is your world, right? You should be part of the conversation. We should be part of the conversation about how these technologies are trained, how they're deployed, you know, what their impacts are. That's not really an answer to the second part. Like, what do we do with? I mean, these have happened, and they happened without consultation, and they're already having wildly disruptive effects. And one of the things that, you know, as this morning's session, not to go into it too much, but you know, there was talk about regulation, but the regulation didn't happen up to this point. You know, we're at a moment, and we are hearing that same sort of techno-deterministic and techno-eschatological language about it's inevitable. And we hear that in education as well, right? You have to teach people how to use it, or they'll be left behind, and we heard that this morning as well. But I have a lot of answers to that question, but I do think our role, this may be not what you're asking, but my role has been taking what I take from Maha Bali and others, a critical AI literacy perspective. That is to say, which is this, I mean, not this specifically, it's not Yeats necessarily, but it is considering the technology in its context, in order to figure out the extent to which it's appropriate to use it, whether or not the ethical concerns outweigh its potential utility. Like, these are questions that are not necessarily being asked by developers, and I think it is our wildly adopting them because it's for fear of missing out, for FOMO reasons, is not wise either. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I would say, is that, part of it is, I think we can bring, in collaboration with, and interdisciplinary collaboration and research, we can bring some of these insights to bear on what happens next, and what's happening now. It's a long answer to a short question.
Which is also such a vindication of today. In other words, we're having that conversation and staging that conversation now. Yeah. Yes, please, sorry.
In relation to correlation.
We might just wait for the microphone for 1 sec, just so people can hear you online.
In relation to the correlation between the industry and revolutionising the world, the tech industry as it stands, and I have personal experience, is backed up by people on low wages, people who are in poorer countries doing a lot of the dirty work for very rich tech companies.
Yeah.
If you just look at Amazon, no contracts, no hours of, and no trade unionism, no rights.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's not delude ourselves that this is all some glamorous new world. It's not. It's open to slave labour, and it exists in this country too, because down even in Google, which I live beside, you're expected to work 7 days a week, keep your phone open, keep your email on, and sleep under the desk, and they throw dinner at you, and some people think it's fine, but it's to keep you sitting at your desk working. They don't allow you away from your desk at lunch hour to have a break, and by the time you're 30 or 35, they presume you're burnt out, that you're no good to them because you can't come up with new ideas. That's the principle. And if you're a female, the consensus is don't get pregnant and don't get engaged or don't have children, because you'll be spending time out of the office and it's an expense that they won't entertain.
Yeah, I mean, that's that larger network. Absolutely. No, that's that larger, network and context that I was trying to allude to with the gig workers and the sort of abusive labor practices that underpin. And they continue. I mean, I think one of the things that many of you may know, but I mean, a lot of what we see is actually still being shaped by people. Like, there's a phrase, photomation, right? That things look automated, but they actually aren't. That there are, beyond just the training, beyond the RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback and tagging and so forth. There's also, active people behind the scenes still actively shaping the outputs so that they look better. And you can think of the recent revelations about I'm not thinking Amazon. I'm actually thinking, but although that's true too, the car, not Tesla, the other one that was just Cruise, I think it's called. They just it was supposed to be self-driving, and then it was just revealed that every 2 hours or actually, maybe it's every 2 miles there was human intervention, right, to make it look like it was self-driving. So this is in an economic context of hype, right, that we have to take into consideration too. Absolutely, absolutely.
One question as well, or to cut in, and I'll use the mic here for everyone. Could I ask a final question, Katie, bring you back to the term science? So I was interested in that because certainly over the years, say working with colleagues in European committees, there can be a sense of science used maybe more as knowledge or body of knowledge, and less in the kind of oppositional way that it's sometimes used for, literature versus science here. So I was curious about that as a term, maybe just as a closing question. Yeah,
sure. I mean, it has been, as I talk a little bit more about this in the chapter, but that sense, a very 19th century sense of science, which is far less exclusionary, finds at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century a kind of narrowing, and the word technology starts to become applied science, and so. But I do think that they're the two cultures thing is a sort of deliberate and perhaps I don't want to sound conspiratorial. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the case by any means that those two things would be at odds. If that's, I don't know that that's what you're asking, but that there are two senses, right, of science, and I think that one of the things you see, especially say at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, plenty of writers thinking about scientific epistemology as an approach that they found valuable, right? So, yeah, I think technoscience is a very particular strand of science that is by no means the only one. So I want to make sure that I'm not implying that they're necessarily that it necessarily is that path. It's just the path that we've taken. Again, perhaps because of larger other interests.
That gives me, I suppose, a kind of a perfect closing note to say that one of the many things I'm so grateful to Professor Conrad, Katie, in her work, is the way you go back to the past to reimagine the relationship of past, kind of present and future, and that sense in all through the talk of showing other possibilities. We were talking again about when people ask us difficult questions. Someone said to me a while ago, just define the humanities in a couple of words, and I said the ability to imagine otherwise. and I think all through your work, Katie, and not least today, there is that way in which you use past, present and future to imagine otherwise. So we're deeply grateful, and thank you for travelling. Thank you so much. I'll just invite Gertrude to close the day formally then.
Okay, I don't know quite how to do this because I have lots and lots of people to thank. Can I thank all of our speakers collectively for really engaging and stimulating talks today? And to all of those who travelled, because there's three of you who have travelled here today. I want to give a particular word of thanks to Katie Mishler and Loic Wright, who had to go off and teach. And the amount of work that they have put into this. And Katie makes things happen. I think you need to get a badge or something. She really does. Yeah. Huge thanks to Connor, to Ben, and to yourself over there. I never got your name. Thank you very much for all of the work today on the cameras and on the sound. And above all, thanks to Molly for hosting us. And not above all, because this is Margaret and James's idea initially, the book, on which I would like to extend our heartiest congratulations for a really important and significant volume. And you can see from the quality of the debate here today that it is going to be a foundational volume for a lot of discussions going forward, and not just in Irish studies. So well done to Margaret, and to James if he is out there somewhere in the ether. Okay. So congratulations.